And we have all these regrets, right? All these things like, why did I let him come upstairs and get changed after soccer practice? We should have just gotten in the car. Why did Eric have to get out early that day? All of this stuff.
Welcome to A Place of Yes. I'm your host, Heather Strader, a podcast about how I moved through my darkest hour. And all I can say is I dug deep, figured out where I was and where I wanted to be. And for me, the answer was in a place of yes. Welcome to the show. Hi, Marcy. I am really excited to have you on this show. Welcome to A Place of Yes. And I just want to
Thank you so much for having me.
No, I'm excited. I do want to let the audience know that as we find our way in A Place of Yes, most of our guests have been related to the work that we do through Jake's Help from Heaven. And Jake's Help from Heaven is an organization that my husband and I started after the loss of our son, Jake. But one of the things that have come out of me doing this work is getting in touch with other people who are experiencing a very similar grief journey as myself. So Marcy, can you share a little bit about your podcast and just the guests that you have and just a little bit about it?
Yes. So my podcast is called Losing a Child, Always Andy's Mom, and obviously named after my son, Andy, who we lost. He was my middle son. And it's funny because I started the podcast about a year after Andy died, actually. So Andy was killed in a car accident, and I can certainly go into that a little bit later if you want. But he was killed in a car accident, and I am a pediatrician and was practicing regularly at the time that he died. I stayed home for a few weeks. Then I tried to go back to work. It was like an utter failure. And I was literally crying between every patient. I would just like try to hold it together to get through that appointment to talk about their child. And then I'd leave and I'd just sob. And then I'd get myself back together and go in for the next one and start it all up again. And I just realized that I just wasn't doing anyone any good, and including myself. It wasn't good for me. It was one of those things. My dear husband, I mean, he's awesome. He's an anesthesiologist. And when he went back to work, it was really helpful to him. It was really helpful for him to get back into kind of a work setting. I actually kind of thought I was never going to be able to do it again. I remember saying that, like, I'm kind of done. I don't think I'm going to be able to be a pediatrician anymore. And so I'm sitting at home. I did start doing some administrative work. So I did that kind of piece for a while. And then I thought, you know what? I'm having trouble concentrating even to read a book. And I could not concentrate to read. So I thought, I bet I could listen to a podcast. There's got to be a podcast on child loss and parental grief. And this is back now in 2019. And I go through and I start looking. And I cannot find one. And the reason I thought of a podcast is because my husband actually had a podcast. He had a medical podcast at the time. And he actually, when he restarted doing it, he recorded one with me where we talked about Andy and just to get him kind of going back again. And he came home and I said, yeah, I was trying to look for a podcast. I don't think there is one. And he said, oh, there is one. And he starts looking and he's like, you're right. I don't think there is one. And then I said this crazy thing. I said, I think I'm supposed to start one. Totally unlike me. I'm a very introverted kind of person. I am not techie at all. Like, I do not know where those words came from. And immediately when they came out of my mouth, I wanted to pull them back in.
I was going to say, did you want to suck them back?
Yeah. I did. I wanted to suck them back in because my husband, the fact that he was doing a podcast, immediately was like all over it because he knows that I'm in such a bad place, right? And I need something to help me with my grief too, because I'm not in a good place. And I was feeling this urge, like I'm supposed to start one. I'm supposed to help people not feel alone in this grief journey. But then wouldn't you know, he finds someone who wants to volunteer and make me a website. Oh my word.
You're in. You're locked in now.
Then the summer, I'm in now. I'm in, right? So I'm having a website made. He asked me, what do you want for a name? I said, I want it to be Always Andy's Mom. And he said, well, you can't just be that because it has to be something that you know it's about child loss because otherwise people won't find you. And it turns out there was a podcast that was called Heart to Heart with Michael. And now it's called Bereaved, but Still Me. But anyway, I've had a conversation with him like, you had a terrible name. So
because I didn't even know where
not my fault that I couldn't
find you. Yeah.
So anyway, we came up with that as the name. Eric and I decided we were going to record like 3 episodes. It was right on the 1-year anniversary of Andy's death. We recorded 3 episodes. We recorded one with him and I. It's funny. The first time I'm not technically savvy. We recorded it and I forgot to press the record button. So we talked for a full hour and nothing got recorded. But turns out the second one was better. So it was fine. We just did it
Did it
again.
again.
And then we had started going to grief support group actually just like 3 weeks after Andy died. So I interviewed one of the other moms that was in group with me who had lost her daughter, who actually sounds quite a lot like Jake, although she
Okay.
lived until she was 12 years old. So she lived quite a bit longer. But she had kind of chronic illness through her whole life and ended up not really being diagnosed. So very, very
So
similar
similar.
stories. So I interviewed her for one, and then the person who ran that support group, Gwen Capsha, who's a thanatologist, which is someone who studies death and dying.
Wow.
She's phenomenal. She's a social worker, and she still does about every sixth episode she and I do together. And we talk about a different topic of grief. So we decided we did 3 and like, okay, let's just release 3. And I still remember my first review that I got on Apple. And the woman, she and I now are close friends. She wrote to me from, she was in Tennessee, and she said, "My son died 3 weeks ago. I couldn't get up out of bed until I listened."
Wow.
And it made her be able to get up out of bed. I thought, okay,
This is what I'm
this is
doing.
right. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. And so here we are. I mean, it'll be 5 years this September. So we're at 4 plus years, 244 episodes in, and still just telling stories. And we're telling stories of all of these people who have lost all of these beautiful, amazing children, and they don't want them forgotten. Feel like it's something that Andy and I do together. And it's just beautiful.
It is beautiful because it is, from one bereaved mother to another. What is the thing that is, I mean, everything is impossibly hard, but for me, I know it was this idea that what if no
Yeah.
one wants to talk about my son? What if no one wants to talk about Jake? Because I don't know if you found this, but in those days after and months, people are uncomfortable, right? Like they
Oh,
don't
yeah.
know how to respond. They don't know what to say. And I remember feeling so desperate sometimes, right? Like I just want to talk about Jake, almost
And they
obsessed.
just don't wanna
And
talk
they
about Jake, right? They just
yes,
don't
they
because they don't
just
want
don't.
to make you cry, which I put in quotes because I feel like I tell people, like, the tears are always just below the surface.
Always.
Anyway, you're not making me cry.
No.
I'm already sad. When you mention Andy's name, it lets me know that you care,
And you
and those tears may
yes.
now come to the surface, but that's not bad.
No, and I mean, you said that perfectly because 'cause they're always there. Sometimes they come out and sometimes they don't, and I don't
Yeah.
wanna say this to people because it sounds crass, but you're not pushing me over the edge, you're not, right? Like,
No,
no, it's
no,
but
it
you're
really has
100%.
nothing to do with you.
Yeah, at all.
The person I'm having the
Yeah.
conversation, it's all me. It's all me and where I am at that moment, right?
I love what you said about it's something that you are doing with Andy. And both are in the names of what we do, right? Like Jake's Help from Heaven,
Yeah.
always Andy's mom, like because it's so important to keep them present. And I love that you record in his room. Are you comfortable talking a little bit about him passing? So he was in a car accident, and are you
Yeah,
comfortable sharing that
I
story?
certainly can. I do wanna say one more thing
Yes.
first that I kind of alluded to. So I started the podcast then in September. So Andy died in August. It was the whole year later we started this podcast. By November, I had gone back to work within
Oh,
2 months. Within 4 months of starting the podcast, I was back to the same number of hours that I had done before Andy died. And I felt fine about it. I felt
yeah.
great about it. And in fact, I felt like I was actually a better doctor now than I was. Because at first, I would get almost annoyed with somebody coming in like, "Oh my word, they're coming in, their kid has had a fever for 3 hours. Come on." Like
Get it
kids have
together. Yeah.
fevers. And I get like irritated by it. And what's funny is that then after all of this, I would be like, "Wow, this mom must be really worried because her child's only had a fever for 3 hours. That's a lot of anxiety going on. How can I look at that and make her feel better and make her feel more comfortable about this?" You know? It's changed my practice a lot.
It's like a
I
profound shift, right? Like it's just
It
a whole,
is.
it's like
It's
a
a huge
switch.
shift. And I do see a lot of kids with a lot of like anxiety and depression and things like that because I think I can feel that suffering in such a different way now
Yep.
that they feel a little bit drawn to me and to open up to me with some things that they might not be able to open up to with others who haven't had that experience. So I did want to say that that was never the goal of the podcast was to get me back to work. as a pediatrician, but it turns out it did because I now had something to do with my grief. I had a purpose for my grief. I had something to do with Andy. And that gave me permission to take little times where I didn't have to focus so much on my grief. And I now am able to focus on this other family and their concerns and their problems and not have it be overwhelmed with Andy just in everything.
What a testament, though, to not only being able to talk about our loss and our children who have passed, right? Like the freedom to talk about it allows you to process it and allows you to then, like you said, continue living. Grief can be so overwhelming and it can
Mhm.
just rob you of living. I can only speak for myself, but I know that when I put myself in this position where I can freely talk about Jake and keep him present, it
Yeah.
allows me to be everything else I'm supposed to be,
Yeah. A
you
better
know?
version of you,
Yes,
right?
yes, 100%.
Mhm. I mean, and now I do other things too. I have a virtual grief support group that we have, I do 2 sessions every week and people come from all over. I've got people from all over the world now. But
Absolutely.
you're right. I should go back and talk, a little more about Andy. So I first like to talk about him as a kid because our kids are so much more than what happened to them. Andy was my middle child. He was really tiny. He was always the tiniest one in his class. He loved sports, but he was not that great at them. But he loved being a member of a team. He was everybody's biggest cheerleader. I always thought coaches loved having Andy on their team, not because he was going to do well, but because he was going to cheer. What he was talented in was music. He was super musical. And if you listen all the way to the end of my podcast every week, you can actually hear him singing at the very, very end. So he was a senior chorister for the Grand Rapids Choir of Men and Boys, and he did some pretty amazing solos, and that's where he would really shine. So anyway, that's kind of Andy. The week before he died, actually, he like I told you, he wasn't that great at sports, but he was trying out for the soccer team. He had the best 2 weeks of practice of his entire
Mm,
life. Like he was making goals left and right.
mm.
He was doing awesome. He was named starting left striker the day before he died. He got his uniform. We took pictures of him in his uniform. So what happened? It was a Wednesday, and I remember you saying it was a
A
Wednesday. It
Wednesday,
was it was a normal
just a
Wednesday.
Wednesday.
I worked half days on Wednesdays at the time. He called me when he was done, and I said, "Well, I just finished seeing my last patient. I'll leave now. I'll be there in 5 to 7 minutes," because we timed it from my office. It was a 5 to 7
5 to
minute.
7 minutes.
So I'm getting in the car, and he calls me back at 5 minutes, and I picked the
2
phone. I said,
minutes.
"Andy," I said 5 to 7. I'm almost there. And he goes, "Oh, mom, but I'm just so excited to tell you about my day. I just wanted to tell you about it." And so he starts just telling me all about this day and all the fun stuff that he's had. And then we hang up like as he's getting in the car so he can continue telling me because he was just having the time of his life. It was just a great day. So the Whitecaps are our single A affiliate baseball
Okay.
team to the Detroit Tigers. And we had an event with my office where my whole office was going. We had to buy tickets, and I had hesitated, like, am I gonna buy tickets for everybody? Because they're kind of expensive, and it was going to be just his brother and I, because my husband was working, supposed to be working late. He was on call. My foster son was working, and my daughter had a violin lesson. So it was only gonna be the 3 of us. And I remember Peter saying, "It'll be a great mother-son event that we'll go to." Well, my husband sent me a text and says, "You know what? It's really slow here at the hospital. It's really weird, but I'm gonna get out early. I think I could go to the game. Do you think there's an extra ticket?" And so I sent a text in to somebody in the office and like, "Oh yeah, so and so can't go. There's an extra ticket. Do you want us to drop it by?" And I said, "No, I'll just pick it up on my way in." So I drop Andy off with this little carpool to soccer. He's taking a carpool back. He's like texting me. He's coming on his way back from soccer practice. And we have all these regrets, right? All these things like, why did I let him come upstairs and get changed after soccer practice? We should have just gotten in the car. We should have, like,
Shoulda,
why
woulda,
didn't I let
coulda.
somebody
Yeah.
bring me the ticket? Why did Eric have to get out early that day? All of this stuff. But we ended up, all getting in the car. I let him change, go upstairs and change. Went downstairs. We all get in. I stopped off. I grabbed the ticket. We're going on the freeway, and it's busy traffic because it always was on game days. And I remember being in the traffic and saying, "This isn't so bad." That's like the last thing I remember saying to my husband, "This isn't so bad. We're going to be okay." And I don't remember anything after that, but my husband got in the exit lane, and flying from out of nowhere is a person going highway speeds, who was also going to the game, by the way. So I have no idea why they were going highway speeds, and just plowed into the back of us. And I don't remember any of this. So what happened is the whole back of our minivan is crushed. Eric did not lose consciousness at all. And he looked over at me and I was moaning. And he looked behind him at Peter and he was moaning. And he looked at Andy and there's nothing. And he was like, "Oh, I got to get him out of the car." And so by that time, like all of these people are stopping, and there's this guy trying to help him, can't get the side door open. He's trying to get the window down. It turns out he was an army medic. So Eric, it's funny because I told you he was little. So he was going into high school, but he hadn't really started puberty. So he's
Yeah.
tiny.
So little.
So they get him unbuckled. Eric pulls him out through his seat, through the front, and puts him out, starts doing CPR. Anytime anyone came, he would ask, "Do you have supplies to put in an IV?" All he kept thinking was, "I just need to get him volume. I just need to get him
I need to
volume. I
give him
need to
some.
get an IV. He'll be okay." Right? Because this is what he does. He's an anesthesiologist. This is what he does. So he, in
He's like
no
in
part of
mode
his mind, did he think he would lose him. Just
because he's
didn't
like
at
the
all.
most equipped person to handle this right now. Like
Right.
yeah,
And that's why for quite a long time, he was the one who did it, right? Other people would come, the fire trucks came. The firemen did not take over for him because of all of the people on the scene. Who is the best equipped to do this?
it
It's
was
him.
him.
So, he's worried, trying to get his airway. And no one, of course, has IV supplies, which is driving him crazy. But finally, then the paramedics come, and the paramedics said, "Sir, I think you should go be with your wife. It's time for us to take over." And so they did, and that's about the time that I came to. And in fact, apparently I was walking around. I have no recollection of this. It drives me crazy that I was actually like walking and functioning and not doing anything. It is what it is. I hate
No,
that. But what I remember is I remember waking up, seeing Eric in front of me, my husband, and he's bleeding. And I turned over and I looked over my right shoulder and I'm just sitting in the grass and I see three people doing CPR on my son and a needle coming out of his chest and his body moving. And I turned to my husband and I said, "Is he going to be all right?" And he initially said yes. And then he paused. And then he said, "They're doing the best they can." And I knew that meant no. I knew it was starting to hit Eric at that point. They are not going to get him back. And I just started screaming then, just hysterically screaming. I just started saying,
yeah,
"Please, God, please, God, please, God," like over and over, didn't stop. The firemen started kind of get me like, "Let's go be with your other son." They wanted me not looking. They
yep,
just wanted me gone, right?
yep,
So
yep.
they moved me to the fire truck, where it turns out Peter was sitting in the fire truck watching this whole thing. And I don't think people realized enough, like, man, somebody should be with him or we
How
should
old is
shut the
Peter
door. Peter was
at the time?
12.
Okay.
Yeah, and he was watching everything, which we did not find out for about 2 weeks, actually, that he watched all of
All
this.
of it.
I got in there, I said to Peter, "We just need to pray," because that's, like, all I'm thinking to myself. Like, this cannot be happening.
Yeah, it's not real.
It's not real. Just pray. And then we were in there not very long at all, and then a fireman said, "Ma'am, we need to put you in an ambulance. We need to check you out." Because I was bleeding too. So they put me in an ambulance, but they didn't put me on a gurney. They sat me in a chair. So really, they were not putting me in there to
That
check
yeah.
me out. They sat my husband and I right next to each other, and they said words I'll never forget. They said, "Despite our best efforts, we're unable to save your son." And I was just like, "What?" I'm a doctor. Like, I've been with kids when they die. Kids die in the hospital. They don't die on the side of the road. What? I mean, I couldn't even believe it was happening. Right. And that's the thing. Then I was like trying to believe this was happening. And then they said, "Can we help you call somebody?" So of course we're right, like we can see the baseball stadium because it was in the exit lane that this all happened. It turns out, my whole office was hearing all these sirens, having no
No
idea that
idea.
it was. So I called my nurse, probably the first person I called, and I said, "We've been in an accident and Andy's dead." Because I didn't want there to be any ambiguity about it. Plus, I couldn't even believe it. I felt like I needed to say the words "Andy's dead" about 25 times just in hopes that maybe I might believe it one of the times that I said it,
I
right? And
think
every single person I told said, "What?" Because I said it that simply every time. "We've
I
been in an accident and Andy's dead."
I did that same thing. I mean, which is interesting because I don't think I've ever had a conversation with someone who is like blunt, I guess is the only word to say it. But
Yes.
Jake passed the next morning. My friend Kelly called because we often did yoga together. She called and was like, "Hey, you up for yoga today?" And I said, "Jake died last night." And she was like, what? I was like, yeah, Jake died. Like I didn't offer
Yeah.
really anything else. And it's exactly what you said. You don't have the wherewithal to handle any ambiguity about it. Like you just have to say what you have to say and you
Yeah.
don't like I remember wrapping my head around it, but not knowing any other way to do it. I remember just saying it like that, like Jake died. I mean, you might as well have said this guy
Yeah.
is purple. I mean, you know what I mean? Like
Right.
or something, or,
Right, because they
you
don't
know,
really and this is what I said. Every single phone call I said was the exact same. It's so funny because, so my dear friend Michelle, who I've told you a little bit about, when we were talking earlier, who had the 2 sisters who died. So I wanted to call her, and I called her, and her phone she wasn't answering her phone, wasn't answering her phone because her son had her phone and kept seeing me come across, and he was declining it, right? So somebody then sent Michelle a text that just said, "Take Marcy's call," because they didn't even wanna say it.
they don't want to say it. They don't even want to wrap
They
their
don't
head
wanna
around it.
say it.
Yep.
Nobody wants to say it. Andy's best friend's mom found out, but yet she didn't really think he was dead because, of course, the way somebody said it was like, "Yeah, they were in a car accident. I think it's bad." Like, no one wants to say it. For me, I felt like I just need to say it. And, we went back to the hospital and of course, we both work at that hospital and they were wonderful to us. They let my entire office just like came to the hospital and so they let people in like 3 at a time to talk to us and Eric had one of his good friends who's a plastic surgery come and sew his head and there were so many things that were happening but then ultimately we had to spend the night in the hospital because Peter had a concussion and I wasn't doing great either. They were going to hospitalize us, put him in the children's hospital, me in the regular hospital, but then they decided we just needed to be
Be
together as a
together. Be
family.
together.
So I'm quite sure those nurses were instructed to keep a really close eye on me and make sure that I didn't have to go off somewhere else in the
Yeah.
middle. But like the next day going home, I think one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in my life is get in a car again. I just sat there. My friend Michelle was there with her car and she's like trying to have me go in and I was just stuck. I just was like, I can't move. I don't think I can do this. And she said, I started to get this panic through my mind, like, how are we going to get her in this
How are we
car?
going to
Because
get her
she said
home?
it just physically looked like you were not going to get in that car.
Well, it's
First of all, is getting
representative
in
of
a car
everything.
again, which I just had this horrific experience in a car, and the fact that it's like I'm going home to my house that now my son is not in.
That is the hardest thing, right? To come back to your house where there is a space where there is a huge presence because it is your family home and you are coming home missing a key component of your family. It's
Knowing that it was never going to be the same again. We were broken forever.
and it's hard sometimes because when I think about those days for us, in some ways there's parts that are very vivid and then there's parts that are very blurred and I'm not even sure, like some things that I think might have happened right away might have happened months later. Like there's just like this
Yeah,
very
right.
strange time. I remember the next morning, so we came home without our son and then the next morning we didn't know what to do and we actually sent Ethan to school. We walked him to school and
Yeah.
we told his teacher, I mean, talking about the bluntness, I was like, Mrs. Moza, Jake died last night. And I go all these years later, 13 years later, I still think about that. Was that the right thing to do? It is what it is. We did it. But we reconciled that it kind of was the right thing to do because Ethan then was in this safe space for the
Yeah.
school day. The school psychologist was fantastic. His teacher, Mrs. Somoza, had lost a sibling when she was a child. Like it was kind of one
Wow.
of those, you talk about Andy's really great soccer season, like
Yeah. Yeah.
was
Right.
that one of these like you make reasons, right? And this was one of those. I made that a reason. I made that like he was placed in this class because Mrs.
For a reason, yeah.
Somoza was going to be the person that helped him. And they had this great relationship. Like sometimes he would stay after school through that whole year. And like they would draw pictures together. Or it was just like a safe place for Ethan. When you were talking about those moments, like when you never knew this was in the cards, but
Yeah.
when you can look back and sort of say, oh,
And there's a crazy story about that going way back to Andy. So Andy died, he was 14 years old. When he was about 7, he was at school, and you know how they draw pictures all the time.
yeah,
They draw these big pictures, right? And
yeah,
with the sun in the corner and a
yeah,
big
yeah,
tree
yeah,
or
the whole
whatever.
thing. Yeah.
He drew his family. Okay. And he's like telling me, I picked him up in at the school line, the pickup line, and the whole way home, he's telling me all about his picture, that he wants to show me his family picture. And we get in, and I open up the door, and he's not even out of his car seat yet. And he's unrolling this picture to show me how proud he is of this picture. And I looked at the picture. There are 4 people in it, and there are 5 in our family. And I thought, who did he not put in the picture? He not put his sister in, his brother in. Who did he not put in the picture? Why are there only 4 people in the picture? And I said, Andy, there are only 4 people in the picture. Why are there 4 people in the picture? And he looked at me and he said, oh, mommy, I'm not in the picture. I'm in heaven. I'm not going to grow up all the way.
I have the
I mean, it's
chills that
just
I
like,
have right
it was
now.
so perfect because it was said in such a way like, I'm not going to grow up all the way.
Super similar story to tell. And that I'm a little like, I'm not often speechless, but I'm a little speechless in all honesty. And I have chills. Prior to Jake's death, a project in school, kindergarten, Ethan's drawing a picture of his family. He draws himself, Brian, me, and he draws Jake kind of flying in the air. So
Really?
I mean, it's just, it was, and I was like, what's Jake doing up there? And he was like, Jake's above it. Like, I don't remember his words. Fast forward a few months, that picture, honestly, like when we started our foundation, but that was in everything because it was just, I was like, they were so connected like in my mind, that was, here's his family. And then there's Jake always watching over us.
And you know what's really funny because people have asked me what happened to the picture. When Andy died, my husband and I both thought about that picture, but I hated that picture. I mean, I remember him showing me the picture and me thinking, no, 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 no. And I threw the picture away.
Did you
Like
really?
as soon as Andy wasn't thinking about the picture anymore, the picture went in the trash
Because it's just such
because
a
even the
crazy thought.
idea of it was horrible, that he might not grow up all the way. I hated the way he said it. I hated everything about it. So yeah, that picture was gone. Interestingly, I am really glad. It bothered me so much that I actually told several people about it. So I told my husband about it. I told 3 or 4 of my closest friends about it. I think because a little bit of me thought it was really going to happen. Like I had a real fear because he said it so matter of factly that it was like it was going to happen. So I think I believed it a little bit.
And I've talked about this more with Ethan than Jake, but because of Jake, I think there's that period of time in kids' lives where they don't know not to say things because people
Yeah.
will think they're weird, right? There were things like when Ethan was young, if he saw me really upset, like, or if I was having a bad day or crying more or just like in a not great space after Jake had passed, he would say to me, or if I was putting him to bed, he did this a couple times, he'd be like, Mom, he's right there. And I'd be like, what are you talking about, buddy? And he's like, Jake, right there. And I was like, okay, hey, buddy, but
Yeah.
I think that he was, he used to always be like, oh, I will always love you more because I chose to be in your belly. Like I chose you
Yeah.
before you even knew I was there. And I look back on those moments and I think, I don't know, not that I'm super witchy or that I think there's all this, but I believe in some of that because I think they're really open to things before they
Mhm.
know that it's weird to be open to things
Yep.
or something. I don't want to say that's comforting, but it's a little comforting.
No,
Like,
it is.
right?
It is. And
Yeah.
that night, it really was. And I feel like it was a gift. And I
Yes.
think if you'd have asked Andy even the next day, I doubt he remembered saying that.
Yes.
Certainly, if I would have asked him the day he died, do you remember drawing that picture? He
Yes.
would have said no.
No, of
I,
course
I
not.
don't think he had any recollection. I think it was a gift to me so that many years later,
You've
I
got
would
that. Yeah.
know. Yeah, I would have that. I
And
would
you
have
feel
that.
comfort in that he's
And he
okay.
was okay with
Yeah.
it.
He's
That's the
okay.
thing. There was
I think
not
it's
even
beautiful.
the littlest bit of sadness in that comment. Like, "Oh, I'm not in the picture.
Just matter of
I'm
fact.
in heaven. I'm not gonna grow up all the way." Totally cool with it. And it would make me feel like, okay, if he was cool with it then at 7,
Yep. Then
I guess I
I've got
can
to
be
figure it
okay
out.
now. Yeah, I can be okay too. It's always a story I like to tell because it did give me a lot of comfort.
It was a gift, right? Like it was
It was a
just a
gift.
it's a gift. It's like, "Mom, I'm good with it. Like this is where I'm at."
Yeah,
So
and, there's another story too that I didn't learn about for a while, actually. So when Andy died, I told you my daughter stayed home. My daughter was supposed to go to a violin lesson, and so she's at home by herself. And so I called our pastor, was one of the people that I called, and then the junior pastor who worked more with the youth. He, of course, found out about it, and I asked them to go to her because somebody had to go get her
yes,
and
yep.
bring her to the hospital. And I wanted it to be someone that
Yeah,
would be able to
comforting.
be
Or yeah.
good with her,
Yeah.
which it turns out there was a whole mess because someone from the hospital actually called her. It was horrible. We never figured out who did it either. I did all this like chart reviews to try to figure out who was
Who
this
it was,
person who
like
like called
sleuthing.
my
Yeah.
daughter. Anyway, so he had been on his way home. So he had to call his wife to say, Andy Larson died. I'm going to pick up Katie. I'm not going to be home for a while. And she was giving her boys a bath. So she had 2 boys. She was giving the 3-year-old, and then she had a baby, I think, in a little bath. And obviously, this caught her very off guard. And she went outside of the bathroom for a second to try to gather herself together because she didn't want to start crying in front of her boys. And she came back in, and the 3-year-old looked at her and said, "He's okay, Mom." And she said, "Who is, honey?" Because he wouldn't have heard any of this conversation, nothing. And he said, "I don't know. Some boy, I don't know his name, but he's in heaven with his friends."
It's
Like, and what's
I
funny is like he's 3 and he is a pastor's kid, but she said they'd never actually talked to him about heaven. He
it.
should have no knowledge of what heaven even is, but yet he said, "Oh, some boy, he's in heaven with his friends."
He's
Like,
fine. Yeah. I find such comfort and I would even dare say joy now in those stories because I believe them so wholeheartedly. Like sometimes where I get sad is that like we lose that, right? Like we grow up and
yeah.
we
Yeah.
lose that openness, that like belief, that like just
That like
that,
somehow he could sense that and feel
yeah,
that and whatever
yeah.
at 3 that I couldn't.
So a place of yes, right? Our it's the name of the podcast. It's sort of what I have kind of turned into this, I don't want to say a way of life, but like just trying to like take this arguably the worst feeling ever, this hard, terrible grief and channel it into something good. And I think you're
Yeah.
certainly doing that with your podcast. I'm trying to do it just in life, but like I always feel like this is a loaded question. But how do you try to do that, right? Like I mean, because honestly, we talked about this. Like if you just allow yourself to constantly be in the grief, there's
Yeah.
no life in that. We live this life where, two things can be true, right? We live this life where we have profound sadness and loss and a hole, but you also can live again.
When I think back, you always have to say with the first qualifier is if I could have him back in a second, I would. But because I can't do that, because I can't go back and take him back, then I do want to be the best me that I can be. And I do think that that new version of me has a lot more compassion than I ever had before. I feel things in a deeper way, and I can be there for people in a way that I certainly couldn't have done.
That you
So,
said that perfectly, and I have said it less eloquently, but I feel very deeply everything you just said, and I agree with it wholeheartedly. Like I have said, I wish I was this less enlightened version of myself to have my son back,
yeah.
but since I can't have him back, I do know everything you just said, right? Like our role in life is different.
And now, I told you I do the podcast. I do a lot of things with bereaved parents. Eric and I now actually do speaking for physicians and nurses and different groups in healthcare too, because we're just taught absolutely nothing really about death and grief, which you'd think
You think
being
would be
in
something
medicine,
bigger.
like
Yeah.
people die, like they should talk to you about how to handle that. And they don't. They don't. So we have a talk that we give called, grief, what they didn't teach you in medical school. That's been very well received because I don't want everyone to have to go through what we have had to go through to become better versed and better
Yep.
able to help your patients. So I do hope And I think it has, and we're starting to do a little more travel and going around to different places. So I think that will help others as well.
I think that's huge. And I do think that's, I remember when Jake passed, there were people who were, his doctors and stuff. And they're like, we don't have words, right? Like it's
Yeah.
kind of like you said, it's a untaught thing. Talk to me about Andy's siblings. How do they go through life now? Like,
We've talked about how, you try to be a good parent and you don't and you mess up and I certainly feel like we did a good amount of that, right? Peter, I told you, saw the whole thing. He saw the whole accident. And in many ways, I worried more about him. They were so close, the two of them. Anything Andy loved, Peter loved. I mean, he was 2 years younger. He adored his big brother.
yeah,
Andy joined the choir, Peter joined the choir. Andy played soccer, Peter played soccer. And we thought, he's just going to be so lost. And I think we very much focused on him and that trauma. And my daughter, who was 2 years older, I think didn't want to bother us. She's 16. She's not wanting to bother us. She's wanting to keep things in a little more, protect us. She still gets that protective kind of mode. But yet we've since learned that the trauma for her was actually probably worse because she didn't witness it and she wasn't there with us. And she had to live it all, but she didn't
there's probably some guilt in not
live it
being
with
there.
us. She definitely always had regrets, feeling like she should have been there. She should have been in the car. I kept saying, honey, if you'd have been in the car, you'd be gone too. Like you'd have been in the way back. Andy was killed. Like
Yeah.
there's no way you could have
There's no,
survived it. But yet, so much of her, like maybe if I would have been there, I would have seen it. I could have warned dad. I could have. And the fact that she didn't experience it with us was a big deal. And that was really hard. And we recently we're talking about things, and she said, I feel like I hardly remember the first year after Andy died. Just everything's so foggy, and she's trying not to be a squeaky wheel, and yet I think suffered for it. She's having struggles now, and we're 5 years out. Definitely doing better now, but had to take a break from school and is home. And I think we're all in a much better place than we were, but it's hard to know. And you feel guilt over it. I certainly feel guilt over it, but I have to keep reminding myself, with the information I had at the time, I did the best that I could.
yeah. I feel like this is an overused phrase, but I find myself using it a lot too. It's the whole like, we got to give ourselves grace. We have to give our
Yeah,
family grace. Like we have, like I said, I'm 13 years out and I wish that I could say that that it's easier. And yes, some days are
some
easier.
days
Like
are.
some days they are. Some days I've lived a longer life without Jake than I have lived with Jake. Like that's a hard pill
Yeah,
for me to swallow, right? Like it's like with that day will come, that day will
yeah,
come where Andy's been gone longer than he was with you. And it's just so unfair and there's always that piece. But at the same time, it's like every day that you survive it, you know that you can survive it, right? Like, you know what I mean? And
right.
sometimes you can say that in terms of years or in terms of several years. And sometimes you say it in terms of a day, right? Like today sucked, but tomorrow's a new
Right.
day.
But
Um,
you're right. Even going back, like how we talked about Andy died on a Wednesday,
yeah.
Jake died on a Wednesday. For a while, Wednesdays were hard.
So
Like
hard.
Wednesdays were hard, and then it got to
It's like the
maybe
first
I
time
could
you
get my
realize,
Wednesdays okay, but the 15th of every month, because Andy died on Wednesday,
yep.
August
And so
15th,
we have the
the
eighth.
15th
Yeah.
of every month. Well, that was terrible.
Yep.
And I remember having a conversation with my daughter too. Like she was having a really bad day one day, and she said, and then I looked at the calendar and I saw it was the 15th. Like you didn't even realize
Yep.
that that's why you were having a bad day because it was the
No.
15th. Well, now I don't go crazy on the 15th
Yep.
every time. Yeah, it's just you make these little incremental.
Adjustments.
Hmm.
Well, I appreciate you being on A Place of Yes so much. I wish Andy a very happy 20th coming up.
Thank you.
I will keep you guys close. I always, we do this thing in our family, not just for like birthdays, but just for those who we have lost. And we call it like a cheers to Jake, right? When someone has passed or just an acknowledgement
Yeah.
of their life, right? So we will be sure to cheers to Andy.
Well, and cheers to Jake as well. We're coming up on
Thank
his
you.
18th for sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being a part of A Place of Yes. And I really have enjoyed this conversation.
Oh, well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to A Place of Yes. Please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave us a thumbs up, or leave us a comment. We would appreciate all that you can do. If you really like this episode, please share it with a friend or two. For more information and to leave us any feedback, please reach out to us at jakeshelpfromheaven.org.